whose frame are you in at that point, right? And so that's what oftentimes happens, because that guy sat there for 20 minutes talking about the dangers and the pitfalls and how disrespectful he thinks it is, and trying to be heard and understood, instead of just holding frame and getting compliance and getting an agreement to take the action. Frame in every circumstance can't be done through force alone anyway. All right. So that's important to understand. Even though it might seem like force and coercion would be the way to, it can be a way to hold frame, it's probably the weakest way. And let me tell you why. Being a person who holds frame may have the dynamics or the ability to use force, which can be important in holding that frame, having that ability. However, actually using force doesn't really work. Force or intimidation can get people to comply and do what you want for fear of consequences, right? But if they aren't emotionally bought into your narrative outside of fear or not wanting negative consequence from you, then they won't enthusiastically comply unless it's during moments of, that fear of losing something, right? They will look to break free from your leadership and from your narrative and remove themselves or remove you as soon as that opportunity arises. So when someone follows your lead because they feel forced to do so, that means that they're not actually accepting and operating in your narrative. They're really just complying to your wishes, which is not the same as frame, because that's in the moment. You want them to comply and want to comply even when you're not watching them, even when there isn't a potential negative consequence. That's frame, okay? And so they may comply to your wishes at the time, but they're going to be looking for opportunities to break that narrative when they feel that they're forced. If they were bought into your frame, then they wouldn't feel like they're being forced to do something. Now, you need to apply that to your relationships with women, okay? Some of you guys think that, well, if I lay down some draconian rules that she doesn't really agree with, but I explain it to her real good and she nods her head and says, okay, then that must mean I have frame. All right. And the famous last words of so many guys who call me for advice at consults, or who end up even in my courses or my programs, is, oh, but I had the frame. I have frame. That's their thing. It's like a self-esteem thing. They got to tell themselves, I have frame. I have frame. Hey, I have frame. She nodded her head and smiled at me with a blank stare as I explained to her for 20 minutes. Some boundary or something I have. So I had it, but then you know what? She ran off and did her own thing, man. I don't know what happened. I lost it, I think, or maybe I still have it. Okay. You didn't have frame in the first place. You thought you did because you thought, well, if I just explain it to her real good, and then she doesn't, she seems like she's complacent enough, then maybe I have it. And you don't. All right. You don't have jack shit. All right. And that's your own self-esteem problem, that you're unwilling to face the fact that you have no idea what you're doing. All right. And again, as evidence in some of commentary from my Monday show, some of you guys don't have any idea. And I don't say that to be a dick. I don't say that to, try to amog you or harm you or try to say anyone's better than you. I mean, shit, there's different times in my life I didn't know what I was doing either. So it's not a big deal. I'm saying it to help you. And that's why you're listening to me. Otherwise you can go watch, chicks shake their butt on some shorts on TikTok or something. You don't need my video. So understanding that, though, frame does not mean force. Frame means operating within the narrative and wanting to and choosing to operate in that narrative. Let's get into that. So choosing operating in the narrative also doesn't mean a logical agreement or even an understanding either. Or I'll say that again. So frame doesn't mean your chick has a logical agreement or understanding necessarily. It's nice if she does, but it doesn't mean that necessarily. All right. So we'll give an example. Your girlfriend could think, I don't agree with this narrative and I think it's stupid. Okay. But she could be in your frame still at the same time. Now, this happens through compliance without being forced. All right. So, in other words, she hates your narrative and she thinks it's stupid, but she complies with it because she believes in you. And she believes that by doing so, it's the best deal she can get to get her needs met. All right. So, I'll use a practical example. Let's say you express to her that keeping ex boyfriend pictures and memories on display in her social media is inappropriate, being that she's in a new relationship with you. All right, let's say you express that in so many words. Now she says that she thinks that's stupid and that shouldn't matter. She doesn't care. All right, that's her opinion, right? But the end result is that she complies and removes the photos, not because you threatened her, intimidated her, got real angry, or whatever, but just because she knows that that's not something you want and your investment in her isn't going to quite be there if she's not willing to be in compliance with that. So she decides to go with that. She doesn't believe that that's going to somehow ruin her chances of having a good relationship or a good life. So she demonstrates, and that's how you can demonstrate really whether whether you really have frame with your chick or not, is when she complies, even when she doesn't agree. And you didn't force her into that compliance. You didn't threaten her with breakups or threaten her with things. So, anyways, she complies. And that's how you can tell really, do you have frame with your chick or not? If she agrees with it and had the idea in the first place, that's not really hard frame test now, is it? It's when she doesn't agree, but then she does it anyways without you having to make threats because it's something that you want. And she respects you, admires you, has desire for you, and knows that following your leadership will get her the best outcomes, even when she doesn't agree. That's how you know for sure. And so many of you guys spend and waste your time trying to convince a woman of something instead of just holding the frame and communicating with her properly. So she's complying, even though she doesn't necessarily logically agree with you, but she knows it's the best deal. You didn't have to threaten her. She's like, okay, I'll adopt it anyway because I love you, but I fucking think you're stupid and I hate it. So fine, good, right? That's frame. Now, here's what happens though. All right. A lot of times, not every time, but most of the time, once she's in compliance in adopting your frame or the narrative, and the narrative in this case is this: we don't keep a bunch of photos of our exes to pop up in our timeline and whatnot when we're in a new relationship with somebody else. That's disrespectful to the relationship. That's the narrative. And so even though she doesn't like the narrative, agree with it, she complies to it because she likes you and wants your leadership. Now, from there, she begins to understand. Because remember, when people make a decision, all right, when people make a decision, they oftentimes have to justify why they're making that decision later. And that's where you'll start to reach understanding. So, in complying with the narrative and taking that action over time, and sometimes a very short amount of time, then instead of saying, I don't agree and I think it's stupid, it's, well, I don't really care about it or think it's a big deal, but he thinks it's a big deal and I understand why he thinks that way. So that's why we're not doing that. We're not keeping photos of our exes. So see now, instead of going from, you're dumb and I don't agree, because of how you communicate with her, you get compliance. And then she is now at least an understanding. So it goes from compliance to understanding. Okay, well, I understand where he's coming from, basically. She doesn't agree yet, but she understands. All right. Then over time, that understanding moves oftentimes, more often than not, into agreement because she's doing the behavior. She has to justify the behavior. She sees now from your perspective why it's there. And now she comes up with at least her own way of understanding and her own way of agreeing with it. And it may not be the same way in which you agree with it, because she is her own person. Okay. But she is in the narrative. That's how you have frames. So now she goes from understanding to, instead of, well, I don't really care about it and I don't think it's that important or agree with it, but he thinks it's important. So it turns into, I don't think that people should keep pictures of their exes in their social media timelines and stuff. I just think why would I want to do that? Because it gives the message out to the world, or even possibly to an ex, that I'm still harbor feelings and emotions towards that relationship, which then makes my boyfriend look bad. And I don't want to make him look bad or make him question the relationship. Even if he says he doesn't, I don't think that's good. I think it's better if you just remove those photos. Bingo. Now she's in agreement with the narrative, as well as understanding why it's there in your perspective, as well as, and she started with a disagreement, but compliance and being in your frame. You see what I'm saying? That's how it works. So a lot of you guys are sitting here arguing with women and they just stop talking, or they go, yeah, cool, because they want social acceptance and they don't want to deal with your headache, and they're not in your frame and they don't agree. They may comply for a little bit, but they're looking for opportunities to not comply, which is where then they'll test that boundary until there is no more boundary. And then you find yourself in a place where she ends up controlling it, because she flips it around and she's not in compliance and you're letting it go. And then now the new boundary is whatever she said. So maybe in that circumstance, it's, well, I just don't have time to go through all my photos like that. Well, if you see something, let me know. And then she just, forgets and doesn't care. And you just don't want to bring it up anymore after a while. And next thing you know, she's got all her pictures of her exes in her timeline, or in her, in her social media, in her Instagram, if you scroll down far enough, and it's there. Well, what's the standard now? Well, the standard is we can have pictures. It's fine to have pictures of our exes on social media. That's a fine thing to do, and it doesn't violate the boundaries of your relationship. So now you either need to change your boundary. Whose frame are you in at that point, right? And so that's what oftentimes happens, because that guy sat there for 20 minutes talking about the dangers and the pitfalls and how disrespectful he thinks it is, and trying to be heard and understood, instead of just holding frame and getting compliance and getting an agreement to take the action, right? Without force. So frame with different people may be different, but in your relationships with women, that's how it is. All right. She can't take an action out of compliance and desire to be with you, find an understanding, and then be in agreement later if she does it through force most of the time. Now, sometimes, though, it can turn out that way. Like, we look at extreme circumstances where you have Stockholm syndrome, right? Or abusive relationships where she does comply out of fear, and then she ends up defending her decision, and then ends up defending the frame. And she's in the frame of the abuser at that point. And that can happen. Sure, no doubt. But it's still the most unstable way of trying. Even if it works, it's the most unstable way of holding frame, because it's based on coercion and intimidation. And so that can easily fall apart, because once, if the fear is removed, then the compliance and the whole framework falls down. So now you have to keep a relationship that is fear-based, which is generally abusive. And so she's going to come to light that you're an abusive partner then at that point. And even if you're not physically abusive, you can be seen as being mentally and emotionally abusive. All right. And that's what you'll end up with. And I've seen that time and time again. Guys following YouTuber advice on how to keep frame with a chick. And really, they're just being, unbending and a-hole and dominant and alpha, and not having communication with a woman in a way that's effective. And she complies for a while, doesn't really agree, does it out of fear of losing the guy until her anxiety blows the thing up. He has to get more and more coercive and aggressive with his stance in order to try to keep her in pocket or keep her in line. And eventually she out. All right. Pimps lose their hose all the time. All right. Why? They lose their whole hose because the hoe gets out of the abusive relationship. And I'm using the pimp hoe example, but that's really a case where a pimp is using violence and intimidation, but he loses his girls all the time. All right. So you got these guys literally who real world do pimping. You know, if they're not getting the girl like doing outwardly abusive things like smacking her around, getting her addicted to drugs, for example, all kinds of stuff to really coerce her and to really get her to comply, like it's just not going to work. And of course, that's not you guys watching my stuff. You shouldn't be anyway, right? So if you want a healthy, good relationship with a chick, some of the advice that's out there on Frame, it's way off base, and y'all don't know what you're doing. All right.